From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Skrovan, along with my trusty co-host, David Feldman, and of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. We have, as always, an excellent show for you today. We're going to have Patrick Burns of the Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund, and we're also going to be talking to Mr. Doug Hughes, the postal worker who landed a gyrocopter onto the Capitol lawn. And we're going to get to listener questions. But first, I want to talk about our website, ralphnaderradiohour.com. Our multi-talented producer, Jimmy Lee Word, has just this week completed a major overhaul to the site. He's added pictures, graphics, and various search features that have made the site more engaging and practical. For instance, now we have a drop-down menu where you can search episodes by category. If you want to hear Ralph and his guests talk about, say, free trade or unions or GMOs, and those are just a few of the categories listed, you just click on one of those and it will take you to a page that has all of the episodes where we covered that topic. You can also find archived episodes by month and year, and soon we'll be adding hyperlinks to our guests' websites as well as any phone numbers that were given out during the episode so that you, the listener, can start turning all this great talk into action. So check that out, ralphnaderradiohour.com. That's Ralph Nader Radio Hour, all one word, .com. David?
Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? I went to the ralphnaderradiohour.com. I wasn't listening to you. It's unbelievable. Have you seen this? It's amazing. It's amazing. ralphnaderradiohour.com. Wow. Our first guest today is Patrick Burns, who is the co-director of the Taxpayers Against Fraud Educational Fund, which is a nonprofit public interest organization dedicated to combating fraud against the government and protecting and encouraging whistleblowers. Welcome, Patrick Burns.
Hello. Good to have you, Patrick. It's Ralph Nader. Welcome on the show. Patrick Burns is a legend in some circles in Washington, D.C. He is dealing with hundreds of billions of dollars a year that commercial interests, corporate criminals often, defrauding the taxpayer by ripping off Medicare, inflating the prices of medical services, for example, ripping off the defense contracts, the big contractors ripping off the Pentagon budget big time, and a lot of other ways. In fact, one expert at Harvard, Malcolm Sparrow, who's an applied mathematician, estimates that at least 10% of all we spend on healthcare is sucked away by what he calls computerized billing fraud and abuse. This year, listeners, that means 10% of over $3 trillion. So it's over $300 billion a year, and he said that's a conservative figure. Patrick Burns is an expert on the way corporate criminals, he doesn't use the phrase white-collar crime, corporate criminals steal when they contract with the government, when they consult with the government, when they have these commercial relations. And as we all know, more and more of Washington is being outsourced to corporations under these contracts, like the military budget. Patrick, let me start from the beginning. Where taxpayers were handed a very powerful tool when a left-right coalition in Congress, led by Senator Grassley, Republican of Iowa, and Congressman Berman, Democrat of California, and they passed the famous False Claims Act of 1986. Patrick, can you explain briefly what tool this puts in the hand of conscientious whistleblowers and how it can get to verdict? In other words, how it can save the taxpayers' money.
The idea is breathtakingly simple. It's that what if the government incentivized integrity? We know that the government incentivizes fraud because every time a liar, thief, or cheat steals and gets away with it, they're fully incentivized. So the idea of the False Claims Act was that you would incentivize integrity. Well, how would you pay a whistleblower to come forward? And the answer was to hit the fraudster with treble damages. So whatever they stole, they would have to pay 3 times back. And that means that the cost of doing the fraud, in theory, would be more than the cost of doing business. The government would be made whole. Whistleblower would be paid from the money taken from the fraudster, and the government would be reimbursed for the cost of the investigation, the prosecution, and for any lost interest. This was a bipartisan legislation, as you said, and I have to say it has been far more successful than even its proponents and architects imagined.
Give an idea how much has been saved since then, and give some examples like with the drug companies or defense companies.
Sure. We've recovered back to the U.S. coffers, both federal and state, somewhere around $60 billion. And that's just
$60 billion. $60 billion.
$60 billion. We've prevented probably 10 times more fraud than that. We have to remember that every time we shut down a fraud scheme and collect $1 billion, we prevent that fraud scheme from moving forward over time for the next 10 years. At the same time, when companies see fraudsters getting nailed, they go, wow, we don't want to go down that road. And so there's a certain level of deterrence. I think more needs to be done, and it turns out that collecting money alone won't stop fraud, but it's a good step in the right direction.
Give some examples of drug companies, defense companies, and also, what do you mean by your statement, too big to jail?
Let's start with the big companies. So we have the huge amounts of pharmaceutical fraud against Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline. These are $2 billion cases. Big cases against the banks, and we've seen that. Swiss banks, American banks, mortgages, billions recovered there. We've seen massive frauds against defense contractors, $100 million, $200 million at a crack. These are sometimes for weapon systems, sometimes for services delivered. I think we have to remember, just to put this idea on the table, that the folks who are in opposition to us are the most powerful interests ever accumulated on the planet, ever. We're talking about the military-industrial complex, hospitals, oil and gas interests, the banks, the mortgage industry. We're talking about pharmaceutical companies. They all hate the False Claims Act, but they have a very hard time fighting it because basically they're lying, stealing, and cheating. And Congress doesn't like that. When we go and talk to Republicans on the Hill, we point out that the Chamber of Commerce never met a big government program it doesn't like. War, it loves war. Nothing consumes money faster than a war. But the Chamber of Commerce was also pushing for healthcare legislation. They're pushing for subsidies to oil and gas industries. And so the idea that this is about small government or versus big government simply hasn't proven to be true. What we point out is there is a coalition across the left and the right that simply wants better government. And the False Claims Act is a way of achieving that.
We're talking with Patrick Burns, who's the communications director of Taxpayers Against Fraud. When you talk about companies being too big to fail, like 90% of the people would like to break up the big banks in New York who are too big to fail, and therefore when they do, the taxpayer bails them out. That's a left-right consensus. You don't say that the CEOs of these companies are too privileged to jail. And one of your salient points is to focus on the CEOs. In what way, Patrick? Tell our listeners.
Well, we have a situation where, let's take a company like Pfizer. Pfizer really is too big to fail. It provides medications for millions of patients around the world, millions of patients here right in the United States. We have big healthcare systems, Health South. We have defense contractors, which are, quite frankly, core to national security. So we're not going to get rid of those companies. We have executives in those companies that are so high up in the chain, they probably can't be jailed. And I'm going to be honest with that. I wish they could be jailed, but the truth is that the person who is the CEO of Pfizer is probably insulated by several layers from culpability in any of the frauds that are going on. And the same is true at Northrop Grumman or at Health South or whatever company we're looking at. Here's the interesting thing. We don't have to get the CEOs to stop the fraud. If we go to a company like Pfizer and exclude or jail middle managers who are actually the feet on the ground, we stop the fraud. I liken it to a vehicle, and instead of blowing up the vehicle or shooting the driver, all you really have to do is take off the distributor wires. Suddenly that vehicle can't move. And so in middle management, people who are in charge of, say, product sales for Pfizer in a drug that's being sold If you get rid of those people, if you make those people unemployed and unemployable, two things happen. One of which is more whistleblowers come forward. And the second thing is that they stiffens the spine inside the company. So when their big boss comes to them and says, George, we'd like you to engage in fraud. We'd like you to overcharge the government or deliver a substandard good or rip off the consumer some way. That employee now can turn to that big boss man and say, you know, I'm not going to be unemployed and unemployable because of you. I'm going to say no to this. And getting people to say no to their bosses and companies is critical to stopping fraud.
What do you mean by enforcement word exclusion? Explain that.
Exclusion simply means that the government, either if you exclude a company, it's where the government says it will no longer do business with that company. But if you exclude an individual, it means that person can no longer work as a manager for any company doing business with the United States government. They're done. So let's think about it if you're a doctor. If you lose your medical license, the curve of your life has changed, and it's not in a good way. If you are a lawyer and you get debarred, you can no longer practice law again. That is a serious hammer to your life. The same is true, however, for managers. If you are a healthcare manager, if you're a hospital administrator, if you're a pharmaceutical company sales manager, and the government puts you on an exclusion list, a blacklist, if you will, that says you can no longer be employed in any company that does business with the United States government. Wow.
Doesn't the Securities Exchange Commission do that now? They go after someone who's defrauded investors and they say you can't work in the securities industry forever?
They do that, and it does have an impact. They don't do it enough, but it does have an impact. Here's the interesting thing. About 4,000 or 5,000 exclusions a year happen at HHS, Health and Human Services, the people who give us Medicare and Medicaid and the Public Health Service. About 4,000 or 5,000 exclusions a year happen at the Pentagon, the people who do the weapons systems. 4,000 or 5,000 exclusions a year happen at Government Services Administration, who supply all of the goods and services and offices. So exclusions are happening. The problem is that the government hammers the little chiselers. And by little chiselers, I mean the people who are ripping off the government for $1 million or $5 million or $10 million. Those people go to jail, they pay massive fines, they may lose their house, and they will certainly be excluded. But when a company is really massive and is ripping off hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars from the U.S. taxpayers, what the government does is absolutely perverse. It removes the big, meaningful penalties from the table. So in a massive case, $1 billion, a $2 billion, a $3 billion case, the government sends nobody to jail. Nobody is having to pay a personal fine. Nobody loses their job. Everybody in the pyramid that engaged in the fraud, that designed the fraud, gets to keep their bonuses, gets to keep their promotions, gets to keep their jobs, gets to keep their stock options. Nobody has to sell their summer house or their bass boat. Well, that's what's wrong.
Yeah, Patrick, apart from the lack of political will, which has really influenced peddling on the government agencies to deter them from enforcing, how much of what you're saying, the reluctance to go after the really big fraudsters personally, is due to minuscule enforcement budgets that come from a Congress under the influence of the corporate crime network that gives money to senators and representatives and tries to keep these enforcement budgets for the Securities Exchange Commission or for the Department of Justice or for Environmental Protection Agency at a ridiculously low level, even though everyone knows that $1 in enforcement against corporate crime brings many dollars back to the taxpayer.
Bingo. You have it exactly right. Under the False Claims Act, the False Claims Act brings $20 back for every dollar spent in investigations and prosecutions. We've done the math on this. So why doesn't the government invest more money in moving False Claims Act and other enforcement actions? And the answer, you put your thumb on it, is that we have the best Congress that money can buy. We do not have a weak U.S. Department of Justice by accident. It's actually what the folks up on Capitol Hill who walk the halls lobbying, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for window dressing. They want law enforcement that's like a Hollywood Western town one board thick with nothing but the desert behind it. And that's what
Tell me,
got.
has any candidate for congressional office ever lost a election campaign because he or she is accused of being soft on corporate crime?
Never. They've never lost for being soft on corporate crime that I know of. And I think the truth of the matter is that we don't talk about corporate crime. When we talk about crime, it's always somebody with a face, generally black, generally poor. So that's always how we show crime. But the big stealing is done by companies. And this is the problem I have with the way it works right now. For the little stealing, they put you in jail. But for the big stealing, they send you to the country club, they pat you on the back, and they say, congratulations, here are your dividends. And
okay, listeners, here's an action point for our listeners, Patrick. You write to your members of Congress and say, what is your position on corporate crime enforcement, the scale of corporate crime, and how we taxpayers and consumers and workers are paying the price. And then say, if you don't know anything about it, read the Wall Street Journal reporting or the reporting in the New York Times or the Corporate Crime Reporter or the website of Taxpayers Against Fraud. Now, this is something everybody can do. And when you meet them on the hustings, your candidates and the opponents to them who are trying to unseat senators and representatives, simply say, we want you to put out a statement on what you would do if you're elected or reelected to combat corporate crime, which is at a level of a corporate crime wave. That way, you force them to talk about it. You know, the presidential debates, Patrick, I never heard any question about corporate crime in all the presidential debates going back 20, 30 years. So people can make a difference here by saying, we're waiting for your letter, Senator, or challenger to the senator. What is your position on corporate crime? They know in their heads that this is a big, big problem in America. So you're not telling him something that, is reserved for knowledge about Mars. By the way, how can people listening to this program by podcast or on the radio stations reach you? Give them your website, your contact information. Patrick Burns.
Sure, real quick. Our website is taf.org, Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund, taf.org. My email directly is pburns@taf.org.
Patrick, are your supporters basically left-right? They're Republican, they're Democrat, they're Libertarians, they're progressives. Give a sense of how large a left-right backing you have.
It is literally all over the map. We enforce a very, very strict, nonpartisan level of discussion. I was emailing recently to a Texas Republican, and I asked him who in our bar was a Republican and who was a Democrat. And I've known this person a long, long time. And he said, Pat, outside of 5 or 6 people, I can't tell you. And the reason is we don't talk politics much because we recognize that that's a point of division. And one of the strengths of our bar, of our whistleblowers, is that we are united so that we have law enforcement conservatives and we have social Democrats who want to preserve and protect Medicare and Medicaid. It's a simple idea. Nobody likes lying, stealing, and cheating. That should be an idea that cuts across the party lines.
And in every campaign in America, running for office, local, state, national, you put $1 in enforcement against corporate crime, you get $20 back. How can we not make this a major law and order issue in America? One last question, Patrick. The Securities Exchange Commission has proposed what they call broader clawback rules for executive pay if the financial statements of the company contains errors or, fraudulent data. Clawback means that the CEOs have to give back some of their pay if their books have been cooked. Are you involved in that?
We support that across the board. It shouldn't just be at the SEC. It should also be there in all of the other whistleblower arenas. So we have the False Claims Act has been so successful that we have now an SEC whistleblower program, an IRS whistleblower program. We have state false claims acts in 30 states. So part of the penalty is we need to make the pain personal. If we bring the pain, we bring the change. It's not enough to just hit them with fines, which can be fobbed off to stockholders. You need to claw back their salaries, claw back their bonuses, claw back their stock options, and exclude them.
We've been listening to Patrick Burns of the Taxpayers Against Fraud organization that's done yeoman work on the issue of corporate crime prevention, corporate crime enforcement. One last time, Patrick, the contact information so the listeners can come and get information and what to do, apart from demanding that their candidates for elective office take a public stand against corporate crime and what they would do if they were elected.
We're at www.taf.org, Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund, and folks can email me directly at pburns@taf.org.
Thank you very much, Patrick Burns. We're going to have you on some other time. There's a lot more to talk about, but this has been a terrific exposition of something that doesn't make the evening news very often, but we can all make it. We can all make it a national high visibility issue of law and order against the rich and powerful in the corporate world.
Thank you, Ralph. It is always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you, Patrick.
We've been talking to Patrick Burns of the TAF, the Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. Go to taf.org. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Doug Hughes, the man who flew the gyrocopter onto the Capitol Hill lawn. Don't go away.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. Go to nader.org and sign up for Ralph Nader's weekly newsletter delivered directly to your inbox. And check out ralphnaderradiohour.com. It's a great website. You can listen to all the old episodes. We're coming up on 70 episodes, and you can go through the archives and learn the action points, what you need to do to take America back. And don't forget to pick up Ralph Nader's new book, Return to Sender. Steve Scrovan.
Our next guest, very excited to talk to him. I'm sure you heard a few months back about a postal worker from Florida who flew a gyrocopter onto the lawn of the United States Capitol. He was not a terrorist. He only came armed with a stack of petitions to get money out of politics. He, of course, was promptly arrested, and Ralph actually wrote a column about it on nader.org entitled, "Can the Gyrocopter Gang Start a Political Reform Movement?" His name is Doug Hughes, and we have him on the show with us today. Welcome, Doug Hughes.
Thank you for inviting me.
Doug Hughes, welcome to our show. Ever since you landed on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol in your gyrocopter to bring attention to the insidious ongoing situation where our senators and representatives are literally up for sale for whoever can contribute the most in campaign cash by commercial and other interests, I was also intrigued by a side story here before we get into the substance of your message for campaign reform and how you want to spread it all over the country. You notified the Florida media as early as September 16th, 2013, that you were going to do this, and you did it in April 2015. You told the Tampa Bay Times in detail about your plans to fly in on the lawn of the Congress with 535 letters to each member of Congress. The Secret Service got wind of this. They visited your home in October of 2013. And still, when you went to that Maryland airstrip and took off in your gyrocopter, you got through the supposedly the most restricted airspace in America, the Congress and the White House. You got through a no-fly zone undetected. Subsequently, the readers of the radar screen thought that you were probably a flock of geese. We spend billions of dollars for national defense. You did a huge favor for these guys on Capitol Hill by showing how porous this very expensive restricted airspace is. And for that, you should be thanked instead of being prosecuted with a trial date later in the summer in federal district court in Washington. I know you don't want to talk about yourself, but as a postal worker, you met another postal worker, Michael Stranahan, you a Navy veteran, him an Army veteran, and you started talking serious talk about how the country is being sold down the river with all kinds of bad laws, all kinds of preferences and privilege for the rich and powerful. You talked about the books you read. It's almost a perfect story of how democracy should work. And so I want to ask you the first question, and we'll get to a number of questions, so you don't have to tell the whole story. What was in those 535 letters, and how were they delivered after the police quickly descended on you when you landed on the Capitol lawn?
The letters to Congress, it was a two-page letter, and I basically threw down the gauntlet on the Congress, and I said everybody's going to have three choices. They can either pretend that corruption does not exist, or they can admit that the corruption exists, and they can pretend that they're trying to fix it while actually they're trying to sabotage it. Or their third option is they can actually roll up their sleeves and be part of the solution. And the substance of the letter to Congress was I served notice on them that we're coming to get them. The message of my flight wasn't to Congress because they know what's going on. The message of the flight was to the American public. That's why I flew rather than deliver them more conventionally. And the message to the American people was, and I'm going to repeat this a few thousand more times, the message is that solutions exist and all we have to do is reach out and do them.
Exactly. What happened to the letters, and where can people go on your website to read the letter that you sent to each senator and representative?
Actually, the letters, as far as I know, they're still impounded. I've got a couple of friends in Congress, and I've asked them to let me know if and when the letters are delivered. And as far as I know, they're still impounded as evidence.
And who are those friends? Who are those good people?
My representative here in Florida contacted me shortly after I flew, and she asked me for a copy of the letter, and I sent her a copy of the letter. She answered me back where she stood on some of the legislation that's up.
But the other congressman was Walter Jones, Republican from North Carolina, right?
Yes.
And Alan Grayson was another congressman from Orlando. He was praising you.
The Republican from North Carolina is the only person I know of who has spoken on the floor of Congress, and he didn't support my flight or defend lawbreaking, but he said there's a reason why I made the flight that I did. He said in his 20 years in Congress, things have only gotten worse, and they're the worst he's ever heard of it being.
And Doug, we're talking with Doug Hughes, who risked his life, literally, by flying a gyrocopter on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol, going through restricted airspace. And he did it because he's a patriot. He believes in government of, by, and for the people. He believes that the preamble of the Constitution, which starts with we the people, not we the corporations. So tell them where they can read your two-page letter, which is now pretty famous in Washington circles. How can they get to read your letter, Doug Hughes?
I get asked that, and I send a link. If you actually Google Doug Hughes letter, there's a number of places, including Reddit, has got the full text of the letter up. The letter was actually delivered to Congress by a guy named Joe Lane, who contacted me a couple of weeks after I got back to Florida, and he said, I've read your letter. I want to deliver it. Would you let me do that? Can you send me the list of names of the people in Congress? I will reprint the letters and I'll hand deliver them.
And he did that? He did that?
So Joe reprinted them. He sent me the second page and I hand signed another 535 letters, sent them back to Joe Lane, and it was covered in Washington on Roll Call, which is the website that covers what's happening in Washington and in Congress.
Did anybody, Doug Hughes, put it in the congressional record, any member of Congress?
No, that has not happened.
Okay. So all they have to do is Google Doug Hughes letter to Congress, and they'll get it?
Yeah.
Okay. What is the website you'd like people to go to? Because you want to spread this all over the country.
I do, and I have got to do a rewrite on the website so that I can do it as a daily blog, which is not really set up for. What I have been doing is I've been using Facebook. There is a group that I didn't found or have anything to do with up until a few weeks ago called Free Doug Hughes. And there's over 2,000 members there. And I went, wait, instead of redoing my website right now and trying to get people to go there, I'm using Facebook and I'm making my posts there.
Good enough. Why don't you give us briefly what kind of media interest since April when you landed on the Capitol lawns? What kind of media interest around the country? And then we'll get to the substance of your reforms to get corrupt money out of politics.
I mean, it's been across the spectrum. I did a segment on Hannity, Fox News. I've done ABC with George Stephanopoulos. Okay. So that's pretty much across the spectrum. And I've done a number of media shows since then. The problem being the more well-known they are, the less time they can give me. And I understand the budgeting of time, but 3 to 5 minutes is a very limited amount of time to get the ideas across.
Exactly. How about the smaller radio stations? How about the newspapers also in Florida, Tampa Bay Times?
Tampa Bay Times has been great. They've been covering my story all along. I broke the story with Ben Montgomery of the Tampa Bay Times before I flew, and he had a photographer come out, and we had a couple of hours of video available before I flew. They had the story ready to go, so they put it on their website a couple of minutes after I took off. Everything
you
was
called
ready
it Freedom Flight, the Freedom Flight. It's also a freedom flight, right? So let me ask you this, Doug Hughes. What are the points of reform that you think the people should demand in the coming election for them to have their candidates for office running for the Senate and the House and the White House talk about? What are the points of reform to get dirty money out of politics?
I answered that question in a few different ways, but in the simplest form, it's this: build a wall of separation between big money and government. Okay. You set that as the objective, and you can fill in the blanks from there. We need a constitutional amendment that says money is not speech and corporations are not people. The Supreme Court got it wrong, and if we need to spell it out in the Constitution, then the Supreme Court has to follow it. Besides a constitutional amendment, we need to go ahead and limit the amounts of money that individuals can give, bar corporations from giving it, and set up some really, really tight limits on what a PAC is and how it can participate in elections. Because a PAC can be legitimate, but 99% of the time it's not right now.
Okay, what do you think of this proposal in the interim, short of a constitutional amendment, which we dearly need? The White House issued an executive order saying that any corporation that wants to do business with the U.S. government, and thousands of corporations and all the big ones are doing all kinds of contracting and other forms of business with the U.S. government. Anybody who does business with Uncle Sam and the taxpayer cannot provide campaign contributions or participate in PACs, in effect, bribing the members of Congress and affecting the way the government spends its money. What do you think of something that simple? You do business with Uncle Sam, you cannot start sending money to Uncle Sam.
Disclosure is the next best thing to banning money in politics. And there is that move happening right now to try and get President Obama to force disclosure of any company who is doing business with the U.S. It is
and
not.
That's being pushed by Public Citizen, folks. You can go to citizen.org and get what Doug Hughes is talking about in detail. But what I'm adding to that, Doug, is the president basically issued an executive order saying you do business with Uncle Sam, you can't start passing money around to members of Congress.
I am entirely in favor of doing that separation, whether or not it would be deemed legal if the president was to issue that order. I don't know, but I'd love to have the president throw the gauntlet down on the issue and force it into the courts and force it into the public view, because every organization bigger than the Girl Scouts would sue if the president went ahead and did that. I'd like to see that fight.
Doug Hughes, the theory behind is, the customer is always right. If a company doesn't want to sell goods and services to the U.S. Army or the U.S. Navy or the Department of Agriculture or Medicare, they're free not to do it, but they can't enter into a contract and with one hand and engage in influence peddling with corporate cash, trying to influence members of Congress or the White House. It's really quite simple. The Supreme Court can't possibly overturn that. It's just good procurement. It's just good procurement policy. So that's an interim reform, which, a lot of times you talk to members of Congress and the White House say, the Supreme Court stops us from doing this and that. Well, they cannot stop disclosure. that you mentioned, and they cannot stop conditioning government contracts on the grounds of no contract if you try to influence peddle on Capitol Hill. Now, you mentioned you want the people to come and get Congress and get back in control of Congress instead of having 1,500 corporations, give or take, get what they want from the majority of Congress. Instead, the government is going after you, Doug Hughes. So can you explain what they're charging you, who gave them $1 billion gift by exposing all the weaknesses in their no-fly zone and their security zone in Congress? What are they charging you with, and what's your response?
I've been charged with 2 felonies and 4 misdemeanors. The 2 felonies are registration and licensing issues, okay? They are charging me with not having a registration number on the plane because they say the plane exceeded the weight limit for me to fly it without registration. And they're saying that because the vehicle had to be registered, then I had to fly with a pilot's license. My claim is that I was flying an ultralight plane for which you don't need registration and you don't need a pilot's license.
Mm-hmm.
But it's strictly a technical registration issue that they're trying to give me 6 years in jail for. Okay.
And the other charges?
The other charges are 3 misdemeanors repeated for the 3 times that I went through restricted airspace. Okay. So they're charging me with the same crime 3 different times. And then the last misdemeanor, they are charging me with impersonating a mailman.
This hardly passes the laugh test, doesn't it, given what's at stake? Now, Doug Hughes, you've talked about 427 former members of Congress. What's your complaint about them?
Well, the 427 members of congressmen, after they left Congress, whether they lost their election or whether they voluntarily retired, became registered lobbyists, okay? They cashed in on their public service, usually as soon as it was legally possible for them to do so. And they're typically getting a couple of $1 million per year in a salary by working for a law firm, most commonly on K Street in Washington, D.C. This is bribery, clear and simple. It's obvious. And it's so blatant, they're not even trying to hide it anymore. I'm going to try and throw down on those 427 former members of Congress so that people locally know who these guys are, where they work, and how much they're making, because I'd like to see a new version of tarring and feathering done through the internet, okay, so that these people don't dare show their faces in public.
And Doug Hughes, you say that many of them are making on average 14 times their congressional salary by lobbying Congress, and they're doing a lot of damage. I can testify to that against workers and shoppers, patients. I mean, they're for sale. But most people don't know is they, even though they're no longer in Congress, they still have privileges to go on the floor of the House and Senate when these bills are being debated, right?
The particularly insidious aspect, and I'm looking for somebody to write a skit of a former member of Congress who goes in to see a colleague, and the two of them are sitting across the desk from each other, basically just shooting the shit as old pals will. And the retired member of Congress says, yeah, I went to Switzerland. I've got a new lodge up in Vail. And the guy says, where are you getting the money to do all this? And he says, I'm just working up the street for this law firm, okay, because I'm a former member of Congress. And so after they get through and the former member of Congress makes it perfectly clear, he's on Easy Street, and he will be for the rest of his life, he said, by the way, there's a bill coming up, and the firm that I'm working for has a client, and they want you to vote this way on the pipeline. And I'll tell you, I'd sure love to be with you when you retire from Congress. There's no quid pro quo, okay? He just makes it clear. He is on Easy Street, and his buddy can be on Easy Street if he just plays ball.
You made that statement that the government wants to put you behind bars, and you want to put the pictures of these 427 ex-members of Congress who are lobbying Congress, you want to put their pictures behind bars. You told me about a unique idea. Your trial is coming up, I guess, later this summer. Is that correct?
Later this summer or the fall. The date on it hasn't been set, but I'm going to try and get a very clear idea when it's going to happen, because the trial is intended to make an example out of me so that people will be discouraged from speaking out on this issue. Okay? What I want to do is turn the public spectacle of my trial, where I'm not going to be allowed to present a defense. I want to turn this thing around by I'm going to bring back something from before your time or mine, and that's pole sitting.
Yeah, listen to this, folks. Listen to this. This is the flagpole sitting idea. For those of you who know a little carpentry and want to really support Doug Phelps and the cause of cleaning dirty money out of Congress, listen to this idea. Tell them about it, okay. Doug.
The fad of pole sitting dates back to like the 1920s. And what they did and what I would do is you put up a pole, a platform on top of it, and the person is going to stay there day and night. We're talking about probably for a period of a week during the time I'm on trial. Just to pick a number, 100 people who are doing this pole sitting, I'm going to be in contact with these people who are my good friends. And I can tell them how my life is going, including how the trial went, because I'm not going to be allowed to talk to the media.
This is a 20-foot flagpole you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm talking
with a platform.
Right, but these people are going to be largely exposed to the elements. It's not going to be any kind of a picnic anywhere in the country. I'm looking for hardy, tough souls of the type who did the Occupy movement, okay, who will tough it out for the purpose of being my spokespersons, and they will talk to the media. But I'm talking about doing 100 flagpoles from coast to coast in different localities. And these people are going to talk to the local media, and they're going to say, here in Iowa, these are the former members of Congress whose names we recognize because we stumped for them, we contributed to them, we elected them. And now these people have sold us out, and they're cashing in by working on K Street. Which is a notorious street where all the corporate lobbies are in Washington, D.C. And you want a telephone intercom from the people on the platform on these flagpoles from their perch to the base. Right. And what would the base be? At the base of the pole, there'd be a telephone, and I want the media to come there, the local media, the print media. You know as well as I do, print media is on life support in this country. They're trying to make a profit. I'm saying these people can get their circulation up if they become relevant, and they can be relevant by telling the truth in their areas. And I want to repeat this across the country so that, see, people know that Congress is corrupt, but it's an abstraction that they don't get upset about anymore. But when they find out that Fred Smith is the person who has sold them out, they're going to be personally outraged because that's their representative. They know him. They elected him. And they see how it affects their daily life, their health, their safety, their budget, the prices they pay, how they're denied health insurance, how they're excluded because of where they live from mortgages, etc. You know, listeners, make it personal.
Yeah, it's very important, and that's the lesson that Saul Alinsky, the famous organizer of neighborhoods in Chicago, pointed out, that you've got to focus in personam on the members of Congress, the decision makers. Well, you're getting some support. Ben Cohen, who started Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream, he concluded in a post for the Daily Cause, he said, quote, "If you throw Doug in jail, I'm right behind him." End quote. So you've got something going here, Doug, and you've got a lot of frustrated young people who participated in Occupy Wall Street, exposed the 1% all over the country for a few glorious weeks back in 2011. They may be ready to join up with the flagpole movement. So how do they get in touch with you again before we conclude?
My email is dhughes, Hughes, at thedemocracyclub.org. And the best place to see what's going on is on Facebook. There's a group called Free Doug Hughes, and I'm posting out there.
So give the email once again.
Okay, the email is dhughes, Hughes, at thedemocracyclub.org. It's a .org, not a .com.
Thank you very much, Doug Hughes, for what you're doing. You're a luminous light in the Postal Service, which we're trying to save and expand, one of the great institutions of our country. They should be proud of you, and we hope that you will be exonerated in court and in the promise launch a massive national movement, all stemming from your great courage as a former Army veteran, landing that gyrocopter on the lawn, the expansive lawn of the U.S. Capitol.
It's my pleasure and honor to be on your show.
Thank you very much, Doug Hughes.
We've been talking to Doug Hughes, the man who flew the gyrocopter onto the U.S. Capitol lawn to deliver 535 letters to Congress petitioning to get money out of politics. To read the letter, just Google Doug Hughes letter to Congress, and you'll get the full text there, or go to Facebook and search Free Doug Hughes. You're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back with more of your Facebook questions after this short break.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
The Ralph Nader Radio Hour is a weekly series where we get to discuss with Ralph Nader what's happening in Washington.
What's happening around the world, and most importantly, what's underneath it all.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Skrovan along with David Feldman. And Ralph, you had an interesting tidbit about the Lufthansa crash, which took place, that terrible tragedy took place last March that killed over 100 people. What do you want to say about that?
Well, a report just came out pertaining to this Lufthansa crash that killed all 150 people on board when the co-pilot took over and locked the pilot out and deliberately crashed into a mountain. He has had a long history of mental health problems. He had seen all kinds of the doctors and psychiatrists in the preceding years. Somehow Lufthansa didn't know about it or do anything about it. And earlier this week, Lufthansa offered a settlement to the next of kin. And I want to describe this settlement to show you the difference between the civil justice system, the tort system in this country, and the one in an advanced industrial society in Germany. So when you hear the insurance companies and the corporate wrongdoers who want to restrict the rights of wrongfully injured Americans from having their full day in court, you can have a frame of reference about what the corporations are trying to drive our country into. Lufthansa offers, this is the German airline, it offered in compensation per victim. This is a deliberate crash. It offered in compensation to each victim $27,800. $27,800 plus $10,000 plus $11,000 to the immediate relatives.
So about $38,000.
Yeah. In the United States, that would be laughed out of court. You wouldn't even come close to what each victim's next of kin could collect by way of compensation for the loss of their loved ones. It would be 10, 20 times. There's a Warsaw Convention, a treaty that restricts how much people can collect when they're killed in airline crashes. But American tort law has found a way to liberate the American people from the corporate restrictions of that lobbied treaty called the Warsaw Convention. Mm-hmm. So next time you hear someone trying to degrade the law of torts, the law of wrongful injury, to give you compensatory justice and deter unsafe practices in the future under the American legal system, you can tell them where to go.
So this is something that America actually does better than Germany.
Does 10, 20, 30, 40 times better than Germany. There's no right of trial by jury in German law. In the U.S., you have the 7th Amendment to the Constitution. Look it up. You have a right of trial by a jury of your peers so that nobody can bribe the court. The jurors deliberate. They have no further ambitions. They make the decision on the facts. The judge applies the law, and you get the result. If you don't like it, you can appeal up to the second level and appeal to the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court.
So why do we demonize ambulance chasers in America?
because the wrongdoers don't want to be held responsible for the toxic cancer they give you or for the automobile defect that results in serious injury or death. We've had plenty of those recalls in Toyota and Honda and General Motors and other corporations with millions of recalls belatedly after people were killed and injured. They don't want to be held accountable, David. They want no-fault corporations. And we've got to blow their cover and strengthen the access to the courts and the right of trial by jury, because increasingly they're excluding more and more victims of medical malpractice and other victims of product defects with their lobbying state legislatures and now Congress. So we got to fight back. That's one reason we're starting to educate the American people about the truth and the facts here against propaganda by the adversaries of the civil justice system. We're starting the first law museum in America, the American Museum of Tort Law, about which we'll tell you in future programs.
It's really important that you're doing that because we've been convinced that tort law is almost comical.
It's not funny to the 7-year-old who couldn't get a decent award because a law in California signed in 1975 by Governor Brown said that little 7-year-old malpracticed by a hospital and was given a verdict of $7 million so he could be taken care of. He's seriously disabled by his parents for over his lifetime. The law that the medical hospital insurance lobby got through in Sacramento cut it back to $250,000.
Right.
The jury verdict was $7 million, and all his parents, who have to take care of him year after year, could get was $250,000. Maybe Governor Brown will have second thoughts and ask the democratically controlled state legislature to repeal micro, because he has disowned it publicly in a statement in 1992, but he's not moving now to get rid of it and let the thousands of victims have their full day in court in California courts.
Well, if you want to ask Ralph Nader a question, like his Facebook page, and then you could ask a question that gets read on our show. Steve, why don't you read the first question?
Our first question comes from Sheldon Cameron, who says, I commute for 2 hours every day, and I see many people texting and driving. As somebody who was recently hit by a distracted driver, I'm wondering, is there anything that we could do about this dangerous phenomenon? Do you believe the car manufacturers and phone manufacturers could get together and do something to stop it in its tracks?
This is an extremely serious problem. It's on its way to being equal in terms of cause of fatality with drinking while driving, distracted while driving. The Department of Transportation has labeled it a major national hazard. At least 8,000 people are killed every year and many more injured by people taking their eye off the road or taking their mind off the road. So first of all, there needs to be no driving while texting. That has to be enforced rigorously by state troopers and other enforcement officials on the highway. There have been arguments that if anybody is caught distracted driving that's killed or injured somebody, they lose their license. And so there's a whole variety of proposals out there in various states. They're getting tougher, but not fast enough. And I would suggest that you should contact the Center for Auto Safety. Just look it up. Probably CFAS.org, Center for Auto Safety, run by Clarence Detlow, an engineer and a lawyer, and he'll give you the lowdown and what you can do about it in your locality.
Our next question comes from Craig Hart. He writes, Ralph Nader, do you support the nationalization of the Federal Reserve System so that its credit-creating power can be used to finance infrastructure improvements and not just be used to bailing out insolvent financial institutions?
Very interesting question, because the Federal Reserve actually has branches in places like Dallas and New York, and all the directors are bankers. And so the Federal Reserve is the arm of government that the bankers control to decide monetary policy and all kinds of other policies now as the Federal Reserve's influence expands way beyond its legal charter. So the questioner raises this issue. In every other country I know, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank, is called the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Europe, for example. In other words, the equivalent of a cabinet-level position. And so I think the functions of the Federal Reserve should become a federal cabinet officer. In other words, just like the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense, there would be a Secretary of our central bank. Now, most people don't know that the Federal Reserve gets its entire budget from fees on banks. He who pays the piper plays the tune. They don't get the money from Congress. That's why they don't have to publish a audit every year. Imagine a gigantic institution like this, the most powerful regulator in the country on behalf of the banks, no less, doesn't even have to give Congress an audit every year because they say, we don't get money from the taxpayer, although they cost the taxpayer a lot of money in their policies that prefer banks over regular people. They supported the huge bailout of Wall Street, for example. There are major figures in the bailout of Citigroup and other financial institutions. So I agree with the thrust of the question. We should make the central bank a federal authority funded by congressional budget under congressional oversight and an annual audit. Then we'll have much more accountability.
Well, thank you for your questions. Keep them coming. We'll try to work our way through them every episode. I want to thank our guests today, Patrick Burns of Taxpayers Against Fraud, and also Doug Hughes, the gyrocopter pilot who landed on the Capitol lawn to deliver petitions to get money out of politics. If you've missed any of this episode on the radio, check out RalphNaderRadioHour.com, where you will find this and all of our other episodes archived on an easy-to-navigate website. That's RalphNaderRadioHour.com. Happy 4th of July week, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Steve and David. And you'll see we're going to use that phrase action points more and more that give you the material so that you can have civic power and get things changed. And once you get these action points, share them with your neighbor, share them with your friends, share them with your relatives, share them with your co-workers. Everything starts with a conversation. Everything starts with small groups. And you can be part of this Ralph Nader Hour. Spread the word. Thank you very much. And have a vigorous Independence Day from corporate power on July 4th.
Before we go, Ralph, what did you once refer to hot dogs as?
On the Mike Douglas and Merv Griffin and Phil Donahue show, you know, they have so much fat and other bad things, I called them pink missiles of death.
Have a nice barbecue, everybody.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long. Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple, just make a list of demands. We demand freedom, we demand equality, we demand justice.